In 1819, Representative James Talmadge Jr. of New York proposed an amendment to an enabling bill to prohibit slavery in the future state of Missouri. While slaves in the territory would receive gradual manumission, the state itself would become another free state. His proposal rested on the premise that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 intended to prevent slavery from expanding into newly acquired lands. Furthermore, many Americans viewed slavery as outmoded. Even slaveholders were experimenting with colonization projects and considering how to achieve abolition. The Missouri Compromise seemed to settle that dispute. That is, until cotton became a major export as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Throughout the age of Jackson, slavery hung over almost every political debate, from internal improvements to tariffs. After the conquest and annexation of northwestern Mexico, the issue took on a new urgency as Americans considered the future expansion of their empire of liberty. Today, we'll be describing key people and events during the American Civil War era. 2, we'll understand the political, economic, and social causes of the American Civil War. And 3, explain major battles and political developments during the conflict. We must begin with the Compromise of 1850. After the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48 ended, there was a big question as to what would happen to the newly acquired lands. Would they become future slave states or future free states? During the course of the war, there was a spendings bill that was proposed in Congress, and a representative by the name of David Wilmot added an amendment to it known as the Wilmot Proviso. It basically stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any territories acquired from Mexico as a result of the war. It passed 83 to 64 in the House, but it then went on to die in the Senate. There are many within the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives that looked warily upon the Mexican-American War. One such individual was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. He feared the possible annexation of all of Mexico, and his greatest fear rested in the fact that millions of Mexicans would become American citizens as a result of it. Just as John C. Calhoun held views that were considered today racist against African Americans, he held similar views to the inhabitants of the Republic of Mexico. As such, he did not want a large population of people who spoke a language other than English, practiced a religion other than Protestant Christianity, and had skin tones that were not similar to his from being given entry into the United States of America. However, the Wilmot provision posed an even greater threat to John C. Calhoun and others like him. The idea that new free states would be admitted into the United States of the United States of America without a balance of slave states coming in as well gave John C. Calhoun an even greater fear that one day his beloved institution of slavery would come to an end. In 1850, the threat rematerialized. While many had viewed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 of having settled the question of slave and free state entry into the United States, suddenly the new prospect of California and New Mexico entering into the Union as free states gave great fear to many Southerners. They viewed that their precious balance within the Senate and their majority based on the 3/5 compromise in the House of Representatives would quickly fall to a plurality of free state representatives. As such, great debates raged in the House over what to do not only with the new land, but with these new states. It was at this time that Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, the famous compromiser who ushered the Missouri Compromise through the House and the Senate, rose to his feet and presented what was known as the Omnibus Bill that had 8 basic points. First, it would allow for the admission of California as a free state and the organization of the remainder, including Deseret, where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was headquartered. to be introduced as territories without restrictions on slavery. The second set fixed the boundaries between Texas and New Mexico in favor of Texas. Basically, Texas claimed all of eastern New Mexico and portions of what is now eastern California. It would set the borders of Texas at its present-day boundaries. Also, the federal government would assume all debts acquired by the Republic of Texas prior to annexation. The third pair of resolutions banned the slave trade in the federal district, i.e. Washington, D.C., but left slavery intact in the city. And the final pair dismantled any restrictions on the interstate slave trade between the southern states and enacted a stricter fugitive slave law. Now, at this point, this bill was a major bill containing all of those 8 points. As such, it failed when it was introduced into the House and the Senate. During debate over the Compromise of 1850, John C. Calhoun, an aged statesman now restricted to a wheelchair, had his speech read aloud, and in it he accused northern states of what he called northern aggression towards slavery, and suggested that any possible dissolution of the Union rested fully on their shoulders for threatening the institution. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts stood to his feet and denounced slavery as a threat to the Union, viewing the Southern institution and its statesmen as the chief cause of much of the division not only within Congress but within the nation. And another senator by the name of William Henry Stewart stood and delivered a 4-day oratory in which he claimed that there was a quote-unquote higher law than the Constitution. It was at this point that it was viewed that no compromise would be achieved. But then another young senator by the name of Stephen A. Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois, came up with a brilliant idea: break up the Omnibus Bill into 4 separate pairs of legislation that would gain enough support to be ushered through Congress. As a result of this, the Compromise of 1850 was born. In the Compromise of 1850, the first pair was the one that allowed for the admission of California as a free state and the remainder of the territories to be organized without any immediate restrictions on slavery. The second set dealt with the borders of Texas. The third pair of resolutions banned the slave trade but left slavery intact in Washington. And the final pair dismantled any restrictions on the interstate slave trade. But it also included a stricter fugitive slave law. This fugitive slave law would allow Southerners who were pursuing fugitive slaves into northern states to basically conscript Northerners into helping hunt down the slave, regardless of their views on slavery. To many Northerners, this was a very, very, very bitter pill to swallow. Now, while the Compromise of 1850 seemed to settle the question of expansion and the question of organizing new territories, it did not necessarily end Southern ambitions. There are many Southern plantation owners as well as Southern statesmen that desired even further expansion. They wanted to essentially create a ring of slave states with the Gulf of Mexico at its center. To this end, there were a number of what were called filibusters that were sent into South American countries in the 1850s. The term filibuster comes from the term filibustero, or pirate in Spanish. One of the best examples of the filibustero was William Walker. He was an individual that in 1851 attempted to overthrow the Narciso Lopez government in Cuba, which failed. And then in 1856, he went into Nicaragua and overthrew the government and proclaimed himself president. Immediately afterwards, he reinstituted slavery. However, Coloradan combat forced the remainder of his troops to evacuate the capital in May 1857. Walker's final expedition was to Honduras. However, the Honduran militia quickly overwhelmed his forces and executed him by firing squad on September 12th of 1860. It's important to note that all of William Walker's expeditions were funded by prominent individuals of the southern states. 4 years after the Compromise of 1850, another incident occurred that once again threatened the fabric of the United States of America. This one was actually prompted by the ambitions of Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. Everybody wanted a transcontinental railroad that would essentially connect the western part of the country and the eastern part of the country. Southerners desired a southern line that would go through their states and benefit them and hopefully expand the slave-owning states within the United States. And of course, many Northerners wanted a branch that went through their part of the country. Northerners desired this not only for the transportation of human beings or for travel, but also for commerce, trade, and industry. In the northeastern portion of the United States, industry was greatly taking off. And after the American Civil War, it would erupt in what was known as the Second Industrial Revolution. In the southern states, industry was still almost non-existent, and much of their cotton could still be floating down the riverways and the few canals that existed in the countries. However, this idea of controlling the route of a transcontinental railroad consumed the minds of many leading congressmen. Stephen A. Douglas viewed his state as the logical place for the beginning of a line. He wanted it to start in Chicago, connect through Omaha, and from there to expand westward, essentially following the Oregon Trail, ending in California. The big problem, though, was that much of the Great Plains was unorganized. To this end, he came up with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. What Kansas-Nebraska Act wanted to do was to divide all of this territory into a Nebraska territory in the north and a Kansas territory in the south. Moreover, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 would repeal a segment of the Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery above the Mason-Dixon line. This would essentially guarantee that Missourians, Texans, and other people from the South would have access to Kansas territory and therefore bring slavery into it. With popular sovereignty, they could then vote on a state constitution that accepted slavery. Meanwhile, Northerners would be free to migrate over into Nebraska territory from bordering states. And they likewise could vote in their state constitution with restrictions on slavery. To Stephen A. Douglas, the solution seemed logical. It seemed an easy one to make. However, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 immediately ran into opposition. One of the forms of opposition was from a group of individuals known as the F Street Mess. These were prominent Southerners that included names like James M. Jason of Virginia, Robert M. T. Hunter of Virginia, and Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina. Moreover, some politicians viewed the Kansas-Nebraska Act without any repeal of the Compromise of 1820 as an immediate non-starter. In fact, prior to the amendment that allowed for the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, Senator David Atchison of Missouri vowed that he would see Nebraska sink in hell before it became a free territory. However, including the concept of popular sovereignty and giving assurances that a slave and a free state would be formed out of this territory, Senator Stephen A. Douglas was able to get the legislation passed. Immediately afterwards, the stage was set for what would become a miniature civil war in the new territory of Kansas. In the North, many abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates who saw yet another power grab by Southern states began to support the migration of New Englanders, Northerners, and especially people of an anti-slavery and abolitionist bent into Kansas territory. The New England Immigrant Aid Company provided financial support to any such individuals seeking to relocate to Kansas territory, and it was organized by an individual named Eli Thayer. Meanwhile, Senator David Atchison of Missouri gave funding to Missourians to settle into this region. They later became known as bushwhackers. Eventually, there was enough of a population in 1854 for a state constitution or territorial constitution to be voted on. The problem is that while there were more anti-slavery advocates inside of the territory of Kansas, Missouri, under the prompting of Senator Atchison, were paying these bushwhackers to cross the border, vote in elections, and then immediately cross back into their home state. In the end, there was a greater number of votes for a pro-slavery constitution. In fact, the number of votes were so great that it could not possibly have come from the small population that actually lived in Kansas. However, there was enough support in Washington, D.C., and enough support in the territory that the federal government recognized what became known as the Lecompton Constitution and the Lecompton government based out of Lecompton, Kansas. In opposition to this, another government was formed in Topeka, Kansas. This represented the anti-slavery and abolitionist wing of the population. As tensions continued to climb, and as the federal government was hesitant to deploy troops to the region to maintain the peace, eventually the settlers began to arm themselves. From the north, they even got assistance from individuals, and this assistance came in the form of things such as rifles. In fact, muskets that were received from New England became known as Beecher's Bibles. All of this hit a nadir, these relations hit a nadir, in May 21st, 1855, when a pro-slavery militia sacked Lawrence, Kansas, the center of anti-slavery settlers, as the governor, Wilson Shannon, a federal appointee, sat by and did nothing. As the mob ran through the town of Lawrence, Kansas, they attacked abolitionists and even destroyed an editor's printing press in response as an effort to silence him. In response to the sack of Kansas, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts stood up in a packed gallery and issued his famous speech, The Crime Against Kansas. In this speech, he not only denounced slaveholders' attempts to use fraud and violence to overthrow popular sovereignty for the sake of spreading slavery, but he also insulted Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina, a member of the F Street Mess, a member from a prominent family, and all of this in front of a public audience. 2 days later, a representative by the name of Preston Brooks entered into the Senate chamber where Charles Sumner was working at his desk. Preston Brooks was Andrew Butler's cousin and a member of the House of Representatives. He approached Senator Sumner, and when Sumner looked up, Brooks said, "I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is libel on South Carolina, Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." He then commenced bludgeoning Charles Sumner to such an extent that when Sumner tried desperately to stand up, he basically ripped up the desk that had been bolted to the floor. He would end up spending the next 4 years recovering from physical and mental trauma. Preston Brooks, although would later go on to be reelected after being rejected from the House, and he would even receive gifts from prominent supporters, including canes. In Kansas, the caning of Charles Sumner intensified some of the rivalries on the ground. There was an individual, an elderly gentleman by the name of John Brown, who viewed himself as something of an Old Testament kind of warrior in the quest to abolish slavery. To him, the institution of slavery was nothing less than a mortal sin, one that the United States of America would have to account for, even if it meant by paying in blood. One night, 55-year-old John Brown led a group of abolitionists, including 6 of his sons, to Osawatomie, which was a settlement on the Pottawatomie Creek. There he took out a slave-owning family and began to decapitate them with swords. This, of course, prompted retaliation by slaveholders in the territory, and once again the fighting resumed. As this was happening, parties were changing within the United States of America. Following the splintering of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, the Whig Party emerged to challenge the Jacksonian Democrats. Over the years, though, the Whigs saw their population in northern states being shared by other parties, including the Know Nothings. Know Nothings were a nativist party that did not want large influxes of immigrants into the country, especially immigrants from Catholic nations such as Ireland. In addition to the Know Nothings, there was the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was dedicated to anti-slavery politics and limiting the expansion of slavery. And then there were the remnants of the anti-Masonic Party. The anti-Masons viewed the growth of Masonic lodges in the United States during the antebellum years as a threat against democracy, and worked during the age of Jackson to put enough pressure on not only political members but on preachers and on prominent businessmen to greatly curtail membership in Freemasonry lodges. In the 1850s, all of these parties began to fuse together. The Whigs, at one time the dominant party throughout much of the North and having a significant representation in the South, saw their Southern numbers growing and their ability to elect people to Congress as growing even more limited. As a result, the ticket fused together, and out of it was born the Republican Party. Meanwhile, in the Democratic Party, growing demands by Southerners on their Northern colleagues to protect the institution of slavery at all cost was creating its own strains. As a result, in the South, the Southern Democrats continued to hold on to a political platform that was very strident in its protection of slavery. And in the North, a separate party grew that continued to be dedicated to immigrants, to the working class, as well as a strict construction of the interpretation of the Constitution of the United States of America. Thus, going into the mid-1850s, there were essentially three parties in the United States of America, two representing two sections of the Democratic Party, and one representing the North, with a growing base of individuals that were becoming more and more supportive of anti-slavery. Again, we must remember that anti-slavery was different from abolition. Abolitionists desired the immediate end to slavery throughout the United States of America, and many abolitionists welcomed equality between the African American and the Euro American races. Anti-slavery advocates, however, simply wanted to see slavery stop where it existed already. Adding into all this was a growing sense of sectionalism within the United States of America. For Northerners up to this point, abolitionists were viewed as troublemakers. They were radicals, and they were viewed no differently than advocates of women's reform and the women's suffrage movement. In fact, in the 1830s and 40s, abolitionists and male women's suffrage advocates were oftentimes the target of mob violence and mob action. However, the fugitive slave law changed all of that. Now suddenly Northerners had to help to police the slave population of the South by helping Southerners, even if they did not want to return fugitive slaves to them. And keep in mind at this point, the Northerners greatly desired internal improvements. They wanted these internal improvements to help with their industry and with their small farms. However, the Southern states provided a single mass voting bloc that usually limited expenditures on internal improvements and that was somewhat either indifferent or slightly hostile to industrialization. 7 years later, though, the major incident would occur. As Abraham Lincoln once said of this Supreme Court case known as Dred Scott versus Sandford, we all went to sleep anti-slavery and woke up abolitionists. What happened in Dred Scott versus Sandford? Well, there was an army physician who had been traveling throughout not only the territories but throughout some of the northern states. He had gone to Illinois and spent time there. He had been in Wisconsin Territory and to other territories. And while on post, he always brought with him his trusted slave, Dred Scott. After Dr. Sandford died, Dred Scott approached his mistress, the wife of late Mr. Sandford, for his what was called manumission or his freedom. He offered to pay for it, but she rejected it. Sandford, of course, Dred Scott thought that this would work, especially given the fact that she had remarried, and the person she had remarried was known for his anti-slavery sentiments. The end result was that Dred Scott decided to sue, and he wanted his freedom. In 1857, the Dred Scott versus Sandford case finally made it to the Supreme Court. And in the ruling, the Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. Now, it was at this point that the Supreme Court could have just simply let the matter go and left Dred Scott with a denial of his petition. But instead, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney issued an obiter dictum, in addition to the ruling that really went outside of the case itself. Keep in mind, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney had been appointed to his position by Andrew Jackson. He had served in Andrew Jackson's cabinet and was very loyal to Andrew Jackson and Andrew Jackson's ideology. And Andrew Jackson's ideology was based on this idea of white supremacy. Even his policy of Indian removal was based on that, in that he wanted the lands east of the Mississippi emptied of all people of Native American ancestry. What did Chief Justice Robert B. Taney do in his obiter dicta? He wrote that Scott was still a slave, that he was neither a citizen nor protected under the Constitution, since, and this is Roger B. Taney's reasoning here and not mine, but Taney reasoned that they were not protected under the Constitution since blacks were an inferior race lacking natural rights of whites. His words exactly were that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Moreover, Taney went on to say that Scott's time in Illinois did not free him because under the interstate comity, Missouri law prevailed. Finally, Roger B. Taney claimed, that his time in Wisconsin did not free him because Congress had no right to regulate slavery in the territories, and hence the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. In essence, what Roger B. Taney did in Dred Scott versus Sandford with his obiter dicta was not only to refuse to recognize any rights whatsoever of African Americans, but he essentially was stating that Congress had no right to regulate where individuals could take their property, including slaves. This essentially meant that there was no state border, south or north of the Mason-Dixon line, where slavery could be prohibited. As a result, suddenly Northerners who once believed that they lived in states that were free of the institution woke up with the possibility that tomorrow they could see slaves being freely transported and freely kept within their own borders. This is what Abraham Lincoln was referring to when he said that the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision basically turned all people from anti-slavery in the North to abolitionist. The final incident occurred in Harper's Ferry in 1859. There, the redoubtable John Brown once again made an appearance, but this time for the last time. John Brown reasoned that it was time for a moment of decision to come to the United States, and he was going to basically force it. He and his sons and his small group of abolitionists planned to go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and seize the arsenal there. They would begin to start arming slaves, and a small body of armed slaves would then grow into an army, and it would force a conflict, a deciding conflict that he believed would lead to the end of slavery. The end result was that Harper's Ferry ended in disaster for John Brown. He was not able to get the weapons into the countryside. He was not able to foment the insurrection. Instead, he and his followers ended up barricaded at the arsenal and were later arrested, tried, and hanged. For many Southerners, John Brown became a warning sign. They had seen the possibility of insurrections before. Examples of these were the Denmark-Vesey slave revolt and the Nat Turner revolt. But these had all been African American slave insurrections led by African American freemen or slaves. This one, however, was led by a white Northern abolitionist. To them, it was a dire threat of Northern aggression to them. For many Northerners who had viewed themselves as under the thumb of the Southern states for so long, as having to live next door to slavery, as having constantly lost battle after battle to gain their interests and their representation in the White House, as well as in Congress through the Three-Fifths Compromise, John Brown essentially became a hero. All of this led into the election of 1860. The election of 1860 was a four-way contest. Abraham Lincoln represented the Republican Party. Stephen A. Douglas was a Northern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge a Southern Democrat, and John Bell a Constitutional Party. Now, for many Southerners, Abraham Lincoln was considered the greatest threat. They viewed him as an abolitionist, when in reality he was an anti-slavery lawyer from Illinois. Everything that Lincoln basically did when he was in office, if one were to go through and read his speeches, his letters, his laws, you name it, shows that, first of all, yes, he was anti-slavery. He did not want to see slavery expanded. He did not believe that slavery was ethical or moral. Did Abraham Lincoln hold the racial views of his times? Absolutely, he did. He really wrestled with what to do with African Americans if they were to be abolished. Should a colonization program be restarted? And he actually supported one as president for a while. So yes, he did hold the racial attitudes of his time. But he was also a lawyer. And a lot of what he did came from a lawyerly mindset. So he did not view it as his constitutional right or privilege as a president of the United States of America to unilaterally abolish slavery throughout the southern states. And he tried to reaffirm Southerners and not only Southerners, but Northerners of this throughout the election, that he had no intention of messing with slavery anywhere it existed, although he was opposed to its further expansion. Stephen A. Douglas, as we saw earlier, really was kind of neutral on the issue of slavery. He was willing to let it expand where he it met his needs, and to oppose it where it didn't. For John C. Breckinridge, he was very much pro-slavery, and both of these individuals were very much strict constructionists. So the idea of states' rights were solid in their mind, whereas Abraham Lincoln did believe in the use of the federal government to promote internal improvements. So loose construction right there. John Bell, on the other hand, was viewed as a compromise candidate for moderates throughout the South. He was basically promoting compromise, promoting some way to find a middle path between all the sides. In the end, Abraham Lincoln and John C. Breckinridge were the major winners in the election. Abraham Lincoln won the majority of the northern vote. He won all of the electoral votes except in free states, except for in those territories or in California, as well as in New Jersey. Stephen A. Douglas, on the other hand, won only the electoral votes of New Jersey. John C. Breckinridge won the electoral votes throughout the South. And in the end, Abraham Lincoln was the Electoral College winner. However, he never won a majority of the popular vote. So he got enough votes to put him over the line in the Electoral College, but not in the popular vote. As a result, throughout the South, Southerners cried foul. They basically believed that Abraham Lincoln was being forced on him, that he was not their accepted vote, that he was stealing an election. Again, keep in mind, though, in the United States of America, it's not the popular vote, it's the Electoral College vote. And this had happened before in the United States of America, where there was no clear winner, yet there was an Electoral College victory. So, as a result of this, Southern states began the process of secession. Now, initially it was limited to some of the more ardent states that were really dominated in politics by groups of individuals known as fire eaters. These were people that were hardcore pro-slavery. They were the ones that were radical in their views of slavery, and they were the ones that oftentimes screamed secession whenever they viewed the institution as being under attack, hence the term fire eaters. Now, President James Buchanan, who was in office at this time, was a doughface, as they called him then. He was a Northern Democrat that supported slavery in the South out of party interest. He didn't want to provoke the South, and so in the end, he basically adopted what became known as his Fabian policy. So this is basically a policy of complete inaction. He believed that by not taking any action, anger would subside and the South would come back to their senses. Meanwhile, in Congress, there were moderates that tried to pass what was known as the Crittenden Compromise. And the Crittenden Compromise would basically extend the Mason-Dixon line across the United States of America. It would ensure the existence of slavery in the slave states. Basically, it was trying to give all the protections that Southerners were demanding. However, the Crittenden Compromise failed to pass. Meanwhile, Southern states continued to secede. And not only did they secede, but as they seceded, they were basically walking in with state militias and demanding that U.S. forces turn over arsenals, which some of these forces were doing to avoid a conflict and because they lacked any orders from their commander-in-chief, Buchanan. The final straw occurred on April 12th, 1861 at 4:30 in the morning. This would be the firing on Fort Sumter, the shot that would start the Civil War. Now, in terms of secession, keep in mind that secession really kind of starts with just a handful of what are considered to be the more radical of the states. So these are all these states from South Carolina down to Texas. And as you can see within these states, many of them have majorities of counties and delegates that are reporting in as for secession. However, not all Southerners wanted secession. So we can actually go in throughout this area, say in the state of Texas, and see that there are core pockets that were very much against it. They basically viewed it as fighting a rich man's war for his slaves. In fact, even in Sam Houston, then the governor of Texas, warned Texans not to secede. He said, hey, we entered into the Union with a promise that we would be law-abiding citizens. This is a permanent association that we took on. And he basically said, look, if you go to war, we don't have the weapons, we don't have the infrastructure. We're going to basically lose. Regardless, Texas overrode their governor, and Sam Houston basically would die in relative poverty as a disgraced statesman for his support of remaining in the Union. Alabama, as we can see here, did have a majority, but it was a slight one. Now, after these states, the other ones took a position of conditional union with the federal government. Basically, what they said, so long as the federal government did not do anything that they viewed as tyrannical or a threat to American citizens or states' rights, that they would stay within the Union. However, Fort Sumter made this an impossibility for Abraham Lincoln. Not only had James Buchanan allowed the state governments to seize federal arsenals, but then a state government, had actually fired on a fortress that held American federal troops. And so Lincoln started to call up state militias. In fact, he ordered 75,000 of them to prepare for war. For these other four states, that was the indicator. That was the moment that would signal to them that conditional union was at an end. And so Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded as well. And it was at this point that the state capital was moved, or the Confederate capital was moved to the state of Richmond. Now, a lot of people say that, or have tried to say over the years, that slavery was not, or the Civil War was not fought over slavery, and today we know that this is not true. Yes, there were some states' rights issues that were involved. Yes, there was sectionalism. But at the very end of the day, when you take a look at what made most of these people in the South fear so much for their independence, it was always anything that attacked or seemed to attack slavery. In fact, if you go and you read the Constitution of the Confederate States of the United States of America, or the Confederate States of America, it's very clear the value that this new government held on slavery. There are some changes in there that deal specifically with states' rights, things that Congress can or can't do with money. But in terms of the modifications, because most of the Constitution is left alone in it, but aside from a modification in the preamble and a modification dealing with expenditures on the federal government, most of the other changes dealt directly with slavery. It was protecting slavery, protecting interstate transportation and sale of slaves. It was taking slaves into unorganized territories. So again, I mean, this is a war that is pitting a free society in the North against a slave society in the South. Slavery was a part of this war. For many people, though, it took a little while going into the war to realize the centrality of the issue. In fact, Abraham Lincoln continued during the first couple of years to always sidestep the issue. And at one point, this famous editor, Horace Greeley, is criticizing Abraham Lincoln on his lack of policy towards slavery. And Abraham Lincoln says, if I could win this war by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could win this war by freeing none of the slaves, I would. If I could win the war by freeing half the slaves and leaving the other half in bondage, I would do that also. But even by 1862, even Abraham Lincoln is realizing that no, this is an issue that has to be dealt with, slavery. And so going into 1862, he's already considering the Emancipation Proclamation, as we'll see with the Battle of Antietam. 1862 is when he decides to pull the trigger on it. Now, there are 4 states and one other that did not follow the southern states, even though that slaves were held in their borders and they were considered slave states. First off, there was the issue of Maryland. In Maryland, slavery still existed. It was such a small group of people that actually had them that there was no real serious push for it. Maryland, on the other hand, did have a significant slave-owning population, but it also had the capital of the United States, and so Abraham Lincoln just wasn't even going to let Maryland make up their mind. What he did instead is he basically suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which is your right to see a judge. He imposed martial law right off the bat and marched what militia he had on hand and what troops he had on hand into the capital and into the state to keep it there. Now, later on, in Ex parte versus Milligan, his action of suspending the writ of habeas corpus was declared as unconstitutional because courts were still working within the state border. And that's what the Supreme Court says has to happen for the writ of habeas corpus to be suspended. You have to lose control of your courts. Now, Missouri and Kentucky, they both tried to take something of a neutral position. Both of them said essentially that they weren't necessarily going to declare secession right off the bat. Missouri, it needed a little prodding, but not much at all. Missouri, what they basically did is they didn't declare independence. But what they basically did is they said, you stay out of our state. And when Lincoln actually issued an order for their governor, Claiborne Jackson, to mobilize troops, Jackson responded by saying, your requisition is illegal, unconstitutional, revolutionary, inhumane, diabolical, and cannot be complied with. It was after that he started capturing federal armories and asked President Jefferson Davis of the CSA for artillery. So, they moved a little slower. The key here is that they moved a little too slow. There was a Union captain in the region by the name of Nathaniel Lyon who decided that he was going to move very quickly to block Governor Jackson's moves. And so he marched into the region. He was met by Confederate forces under Sterling Price, and they engaged at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. And even though Lyon lost the battle, he was able to buy the Union forces enough time to march troops into the region and basically keep Missouri from ever joining the CSA. Now, in the case of Kentucky, Kentucky issued very clear orders to both sides, stay out or else. What happened in Kentucky, though, is there was a militia leader right across the river in a city by the name of Cairo, and this guy's name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. And he's sitting there in Illinois. He's not really doing anything. He's training, and the Confederate general that's opposite him, just outside of Kentucky, a guy by the name of Leonidas Polk, decides that inaction is going to lead to Grant taking Kentucky, which Grant was in no condition to do, but Pope couldn't know that. So he invades Kentucky, and the result was that immediately, the moment he invaded, the state legislatures called, he invades on September 3rd, state legislatures called on September 6th. They've denounced the Confederacy, and they've asked for Union help to repel Pope from their borders. And it was only after this that Grant is then sent across the border to rid Kentucky of Confederate forces. So that's what kept Kentucky in the border, or in the war. So the big question is, what happened to this little guy right here? That little guy. Well, West Virginia lay on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, and since colonial days, this area right here, the eastern seaboard, this was viewed as being the home to all of these major and very wealthy plantation owners. They dominated state politics, were constantly working against West Virginian interests. West Virginia, this was a state that relied on internal improvements to ship its products to market. It was an area that would be linked in very closely with the northern industrial economy of the North. And usually what you find here in West Virginia were actually smaller freeholders, not necessarily slaveholders. And as we can see, there's quite a bit of a section here in West Virginia that's straight out calling against secession. So they don't want it. So what essentially they end up doing is they end up declaring, they end up seceding from Virginia, and then being admitted into the Union. So it's kind of funny, here's Lincoln in Washington, D.C., and he's decrying secession as unconstitutional. And yet he turns right around and annexes a state that seceded from another state that has seceded from the Union, according to him, unconstitutional and illegally. So that's how West Virginia came into power, or into being. Now, organizing the troops, right off the bat, they started to organize, and the last time the United States of America had fought a serious engagement was 1846, but the War of 1846, really, Mexican-American War, wasn't a very prolonged one. It just kind of gave them a taste of conflict. Prior to that, the only other war they had been in was, the War of 1812, really. In terms of fighting in a European style. All their other conflicts had been against Native Americans, which was a completely different type of warfare. So what they had to do is they had to start training all of these men. In the case of both sides, really like 75,000 men each side. That's what they're looking at for their formal, units. Now, in the southern states, they would still largely follow, or not really, in both states, it was kind of interesting. They took a form of organizing their army that is used really in countries that have large standing armies, so countries like France and Britain and Russia. So it starts at the most basic large unit. This is the infantry led by a colonel. Then it's you get 4 regiments that start in infantry. That has a brigadier general. And they're occasionally supported by cavalry and artillery units. And then you get into the infantry, which is 3 divisions that's supported by cavalry and artillery. That has your brigadier, your major general. So this goes back to the Napoleonic concept of conflict, where you have these smaller units that are able to operate independently or come together as one large unit. And then you start to get into your infantry corps. So whenever you hear, watch these old Civil War movies, and they're talking about this corps, that corps, this is those generals right there. And you can see that the Union and the Confederacy, they take on different insignias, because to them, this represents the Revolutionary War. So they're going to start adopting titles that are reminiscent of George Washington. For these guys, it's a war for Union. This is a modern war. And of course, an army itself has this composure. So we look at this and we think, oh, there's 2 sides. There's a Union army and then there's a Confederate army. Absolutely not. All of these are represented by the states. So you'll have Massachusetts sending Massachusetts, regiments and forming brigades, and so you can have within a division, a regiment, one regiment from this part of Massachusetts, two more from that part of Massachusetts. You could potentially have in an infantry division one brigade from one state and two brigades from another. In a corps, you could have all sorts of states combined, and I mean, so it gets really really crazy. So when they're fighting this war, one of the big problems here is that you have some of these units that are being sent out. It's like you have the Iron Brigade, the famous Iron Brigade. This was a Union fighting force, and they start off with all these young lads from the mines of the North, and they're considered, well, really really good unit. The Iron Brigade was, and what happens? Well, they start losing guys, and then maybe they get one more guy to join that to replace one of those guys, but then they lose even more, and they don't get reinforcements, and then they lose even more, and then you end up with a war, and you have like this small group of guys walking around. Yeah, they are the Iron Brigade, but there's no brigade anymore, and so they're pretty much folded into another unit. It's really not going to be until the Spanish-American War to when the United States just says enough, and they say there's one army. We're going to recruit people, fold them in where we need them, not where the states want to put them. And then it gets even more weird when you get down into the lower ranks. I mean, you actually had people that would try to elect their own captains and sergeants and stuff like that. They wanted to be democratic in the unit, and here we are going into this conflict that's as much this is a changing war. This is the industrialization of war. This is the beginning of that process that we're going to see emerge a little bit more when the late 1800s rolls around, and we have the Boer War, and we have the Spanish-American War, but full-fledged when it hits the World War II. Now, in addition to that, weapons had greatly changed since the War of 1812, and they'd even got more powerful since the War of the Mexican-American War. The infantrymen, for example, now were armed with these Enfield and Springfield muskets that could fire accurately for hundreds of yards instead of just maybe 100-yard. And we're going to continue to do the form of fighting where you have lines of people that line up across from each other and then start delivering volleys into their ranks, and then maybe follow that up with a bayonet charge. This conflict is going to see the very first repeating rifles, the first six-shooters. This war is going to see the first ironclad boats, the Monitor and the Merrimack. The cannonry, the artillery becomes much more powerful, as you can see with the 8.5-ton Dictator that was be used against or during sieges. And that's not to include all the old favorites, using grape, for example, in cannons. Grape, whenever you hear the term grape, that's basically taking all these metal fragments, sticking it into a cannon, and firing it, and just shredding the infantry in front of you. And those are only just the more standard ones. Abraham Lincoln, he's a little sadistic. People don't realize this about him. He actually was really into some of the innovations in military technology coming up in the Civil War. In fact, he was really awed at this bullet that could be fired that exploded. But then he decided, it's not humane. I mean, it just caused too much carnage. And it's not just simply weaponry that's changing. In the industrial centers of the North, they start coming up with these, pre-fitted boots in order to just equip and clothe people, their soldiers so much easier. Canned food, We're moving into industrial processed and canned food during this time period, so it's society itself is industrializing on the back of this war. So the fighting, I'm not going to go into great detail. I'm not going to tell you what happened on every single battlefield. I just want to get like a gist of what's going on here. That's the focus on the actual war itself. Early on, the war for the South was very basic. For Southern strategy, it was just simple defensive. Defend the southern states. And one thing that the Southerners recognized is that they had great interior lines. And interior lines basically means that, you don't have far to travel to deploy troops from point A to point B. So if you're looking at it as a circle, I mean, everywhere you go, the distance is short. So compared to the North that has to go around your lines in order to move men and material into position. So for the South, it was always defensive war. For the North, they came up with the concept under Henry Halleck and Winfield Scott that they were going to use what was known as the Anaconda Plan. And this idea is really basic. Use the overwhelming numbers in the U.S. Navy to establish a blockade and keep supplies from coming in and cotton from going out. In the meantime, start slicing the country or the southern states in half, especially with the Mississippi River, and just use a combined land and naval power to just whittle the South down. And then like an anaconda, just slowly start to squeeze, and as you squeeze, take more territory. Now, as most wars go, everybody went into this conflict believing that it was going to be over with by Christmas. It seems like every war starts this way. The very first battle that takes place is in the Western Theater. So what I'm doing is I'm taking this war and I'm dividing it in half. Eastern Theater, Western Theater. So the very first battle is going to happen over here. And that's how we're going to try to look at all these battles. Start here, go here. Start here, go there. So the very first one was at the Battle of Manassas, also known as the Battle of Bull Run, depending on which side you are on. Bull Run. Basically, Bull Run, it's this key position on railroad lines. One thing that the North realized is if you can capture key points on these rail lines and key bodies of water, like the Tennessee River Valley, for example, the Mississippi, then you can basically slow the South's efforts by choking off their means of transportation. So, first Bull Run, Battle of Manassas. It was fought on July 21st, 1861. And it's 35,000 men on the Union side against, initially half that number on the South and on the Southern side until they're reinforced. And it's over this rail junction. And it starts off pretty basic. Union's marching, South's marching, they're meeting, exchanging fire and artillery. But what's really happening in this war is these two sides were getting their first taste for battle. So one of the big problems that both sides had was the color of their uniforms. I mean, you had uniforms. Every state made their own uniforms. So you had some that, like the Zouaves, that were pretty cool looking, but little much, not really something that you would imagine sending a soldier to war in. Sometimes, in this case, you would have two sides that would be wearing dark blue. I mean, they're both Americans, so that's the American color. So it's not really until after they start realizing, like especially after the Battle of Bull Run, to change up their colors, that you start seeing more and more Confederate forces either wearing gray, or more commonly than not, they were wearing a butternut color, kind of a beigeish color from homespun cloth, because they didn't have any factories, so they couldn't keep producing the gray uniforms. So usually the Southern soldier was hoping to get a package from home that contained clothes that his wife was having to sit there and sew, So, Battle of Bull Run, they meet. Really, what ends up happening here is it's pretty even, but then there's an artillery officer by the name of Thomas J. Jackson. Uh, while the South was being pushed pretty hard, he managed to keep his troops under, discipline, under control. He holds a line, and this provided enough of strength in the Confederate alliance where they were able to, the northern lines broke against them, and then they were able to rout the northerners. So this is where Stonewall Jackson gets his famous nickname after General Bernard B. cried out, "Look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall, rally behind the Virginians." And after that, he's known as Stonewall Jackson, and his men become the Stonewall Brigade. So, like the Iron Brigade of Wisconsin, the Stonewall Brigade would eventually end up as just a small group of men being folded into other units by the end of the war, just from loss of and due to casualties. So this is the first one. It's a disgrace for the North. The McDowell's troops march across the Potomac. They are quickly routed. They run back across the Potomac, and then another pattern. This is where one pattern begins. For the North, up to 1863, it's going to be general put in charge, general leads troops, general loses position, and then rinse and repeat. Now, following that one, McDowell was replaced by another officer, and this guy's name is George B. McClellan. And George B. McClellan was a younger officer who styled himself as something of a Napoleon. He was a very able administrator, excellent in terms of training, wrong man in terms of leading a battlefield unit, though, just in terms of the aggressiveness that Lincoln wanted. I mean, McClellan was fine as a general. It's just, Lincoln knew that support in the North wasn't going to last forever for this war. He needed it over ASAP. And McClellan, he takes the Army of Potomac, trains them, turns them into a very efficient, very good fighting machine in terms of discipline and just ability. But then he never used it. So, in fact, he didn't even really have much respect for Lincoln either. In fact, he used to refer to him openly as like the original guerrilla. He one time came home, and Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward were sitting in the parlor waiting to have a conference with him, and McClellan went upstairs. And then minutes pass by, and then finally a steward, a servant comes down and says, "Oh, he's gone to sleep." So kind of really his ego was a bit much. Finally, Lincoln pressures McClellan into moving, not just sitting right outside of Washington, but actually moving against the enemy. So what McClellan comes up with is what's known as the Peninsula Campaign. He is going to march his troops up this peninsula right here that saw the ending days of the American Revolutionary War, and march on Richmond, Virginia, and therefore save his troops from having to do this longer, possibly more costly overland march, and then he could also be supported by his navy. And what results is he finally gets over into the peninsula, and then he stays place for long enough for Robert E. Lee to actually start getting some troops, some reinforcements, or not Lee, but Joseph Johnston, to get reinforcements. And then when he finally does march, he's always, again, very, very cautious in his engagements. So what basically happens at, one particular encounter, McClellan, who has like 150,000 troops to Johnston's 60,000, is sitting there, looking out at the fortifications opposite him, and he actually believes that Johnston has well over 660,000 people. He actually thinks Johnston at one point had like twice his numbers. What he was actually looking at is there was this actor turned general that came up with this idea that he was going to paint a bunch of wooden logs black and then set them up on wheels and make them look like cannons. They called them Quaker cannons. And then what he did is he would march his men up to the line, and then he would, once they got into a point of the line that was shielded from Union eyes, is he would march them all the way back around and then march them across again. And so it looks like there's, troop movement after troop movement after troop, and it's really just the same guys walking around in circles. So Johnston, he stays there, and then finally he begins to engage Johnston again, or Johnston begins to engage him in conflict, trying to push him out. And in the process, Johnston himself is wounded. And what happens after this is he's replaced by Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee initially is looked down on by his troops because what he's constantly having them do is to dig in, to entrench. So everywhere he went, he had him entrenched. So earned him a lot of, kind of sobriquets, nicknames among his men. But what he's able to do here is he's able to engage McClellan, and then McClellan, retreats, and then he engages him, does this through the course of 7 battles, occurring over 7 days, finally culminating in the Battle of Malvern Hill, in which Lee attacks an entrenched position. He ends up losing like 20,000 men, and I mean it was so brutal that one of his I'm sorry, he didn't lose 20,000 on that one. He lost a lot of men on the Battle of Malvern Hill, and one of his leading generals by the name of Daniel H. Hill referred to it. He said it wasn't war, it was murder that happened there. But regardless, by 2nd July 1862, over the course of the 7 days war, here Lee, having only 60,000 men, had pushed an army of 150,000 back. Lee lost 20,000 men, McClellan lost 16,000, but still pushes the Army of the Potomac back. And from here, what's McClellan going to have to do? Well, he's going to have to retreat back because he's lost the initiative. Now, as this is happening up here in the north, what the Confederates do is they basically unleashed Stonewall Jackson. And in the course of what becomes known as the Shenandoah Valley Campaign, what Jackson does is these forced marches after forced marches. And all he's doing is keeping federal forces pinned down up here so they can't go and support McClellan, who's operating against the capital. And it works beautifully. So it's at this point that Lee makes a gambit. He decides what he's going to do is he's going to try to get his troops out of Virginia, and he wants to take them up into Maryland, and the idea is he'll be able to, get provisions while he's up there, and he can also link up with his other units and hopefully get enough Marylanders on his side to grow in numbers, and from there take the capital. However, McClellan is able to march out and engage him in what becomes known as the Battle of Antietam, or the Battle of Sharpsburg, on 17 September 1862. What happens is it's a very intense, very nasty war. In the end, like most of the other battles, it's a stalemate. And in this case, Lee realizes there's not going to be a mass Maryland uprising, and so he retreats back across into the state line into Virginia, leaving McClellan with the field. Now, back in Washington, Lincoln had been waiting for a moment like this. He had actually decided and announced to his cabinet that he was issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. And he was going to make it to where it came into effect in January of 1863, but he wanted to wait for an actual Union victory to announce it. And to Lincoln, this is a war measure. At this point, he's starting to come around to the idea of abolition as an absolute necessity. He's starting to realize that if you leave slavery intact, all that's going to happen is some event's going to happen in the future. Slaveholders are going to see their property is being threatened, and the potential for civil war is going to break out again. So he realizes it has to end. So what the Emancipation Proclamation did is it said that any slaves since slaves are property, and since their property used to promote insurrection against the forces of the United States, or the legitimate government of the United States of America, any slaves found in areas occupied by Union forces will be confiscated. Basically, they'll be treated as contraband. So there's some problems with the Emancipation Proclamation. First off, it only works wherever the Union Army is. So if the Union Army has won this area, then yeah, those slaves are free. Everything else, no. Another problem with the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln understands is that it's not really going to be enforceable until it goes through the courts, because what he's basically saying is that Southerners are using it to support an illegal overthrow of the federal government. So you would essentially have to take every single slaveholder through the courts and prove that they were guilty, and therefore the seizure was legal. So he understands, he's passing this with the understanding at this point, I'm going to actually have to pass an amendment if I want to do away with slavery, and I have to win the war first. Now, after this conflict, the Union and Southern forces are going to meet again, this time outside of outside of a city named Fredericksburg in Virginia. And this is going to be late December of 1862. What's happened is Andrew Burnside's replaced McClellan, after Antietam, because, McClellan, not only had made all these statements about Lincoln, but, he let Lee get away. And, McClellan was under pressure to hurry up and attack. But his attack is delayed because in order to attack the city, he's got to get boats to help him ford the river. And this gave Lee plenty of time to prepare for him. So when they finally meet on December 13th, he has 113,000 people against Lee's 75,000, but Lee's men have entrenched very well, especially in the center of the line at a point that's known as Marye's Heights. And Marye's Heights was significant. It's not only a key point in the line, but what you have is a small, kind of low stone wall running across the front of Lee's lines, and it lets his men just sit there and take cover and just shoot at leisure against the oncoming exposed Union forces. So after, an intense period of fighting, on the 13th, just trying to cross Marye's Heights, cost the Union significantly. In fact, Fredericksburg costs 12,000 some odd casualties for the North, only 5,000 for the Confederates. And, Lee himself was watching the fighting in front of Marye's Heights, and this is when he looks at Longstreet and he says, it's good that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it. In fact, one soldier told a reporter afterwards that, quote, we might as well have tried to take hell. And reports say that afterwards there were so many corpses left on the body field you could potentially walk from one side to the other without ever letting your foot hit bare earth. So that's it for 62. Burnside loses, he's gone. What's going to happen next? Well, this time it's a new general. This time it's going to be Joseph Hooker. And for those of you listening to the video, yes, that is what that profession was named after, because he was in charge of the red light district in Washington and tried to claim it up. Hence the name. Now, 1861 and 2 was actually very good for the West, and really it stars this guy right here, Ulysses Grant. In case you're wondering, his real name wasn't Ulysses S. Grant. When he was applying to the Academy, his state senator, who didn't even know Grant, was filling out, the letter, and he wrote in Ulysses S. Grant. And people you always used to ask him, what does the S stand for? And Grant was like, oh, beats me. I have no clue. But Grant starts off, his military career started off rather ignobly. He was an officer in the war during the Mexican-American War, spent a lot of time in California, became an alcoholic while he was out there. It's one of the reasons why he had to get out. When he returned to Illinois, he was able to get off the sauce, but he never amounted to anything in civilian life. Couldn't make a penny to really keep his family, well supplied. So when the war started, he volunteered as a leader of a militia, and his very first posting was here in Southern Illinois. But after that, he quickly begins to amass a name for himself as someone that can get things done. His first major command was against Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, two key forts right here. Because once they collapsed, the Union Navy had access to all this. In Tennessee, these border states were crucial because at least half or more of the Confederate industrial base was located in these border states. Tennessee was another one of those important states. Take Tennessee, you're cutting down the Southern war capacity even further. So it was a serious victory. Now, another major conflict was the Battle of Pea Ridge. And in the Battle of Pea Ridge, this is an interesting fight. Happens out here right outside of Indian Territory, and it's the Union versus the Confederate. And it's actually, half the Cherokee Nation supporting the Confederates, half supporting the Union. There's some other tribes in there as well. But this goes all the way back to Indian removal, with those small groups supporting removal and those other groups not. I mean, Indian Territory is itself going through a civil war right now. Really, Pea Ridge, this is it for Arkansas. So you can check that box, you can check that box, following these two battles. And coming in behind them, you had the Battle of Shiloh right here in 1862. Be followed by Murfreesboro, 62 and 63. And Battle of Shiloh, this was really the true eye-opener for both sides of the war. What happened is, outside of Shiloh, forces under General Pierre Beauregard and General A.S. Johnston attacked Grant's lines, and Grant, at this time, the general, wasn't really ready for it, and so his troops get pushed back, but they hold at what becomes known as the Hornet's Nest. And then the next day, with reinforcements, they push back against Johnston's lines, and Johnston himself is wounded in the leg, doesn't recognize it, ends up dying from blood loss as a result. But as James M. McPherson writes, Shiloh was the most ghastly bloodbath in the history of the Western Hemisphere thus far. The later Civil War batters would put it in 7th place in this respect. More than 1,700 men were killed and 8,000 wounded on each side. Of the 16,500 total wounded, over 2,000 more men would die soon. Shiloh was America's baptism in real war. So the casualties are mounting even greater and greater on both sides. And one of the, it's not just battlefield deaths, but it's also deaths just due to infection at this time. Germ theory, the treatment for wounds on the American battlefield hasn't caught up to germ theory. They don't really understand what causes infections. So, dipping something in, quick dip in alcohol or rinsing with warm water is considered enough to clean a scalpel before working on another guy's bullet hole in his leg. So gangrene, major concern. And Florence Nightingale had her time in the Crimean War, but again, battlefield medicine, it's not there yet. So a lot of people are dying of infection in this war. But it's going to be conclusion of 1962. Tennessee, it's on the verge of falling, and over here in New Orleans, this has been seized by Farragut, and so now you essentially have the Navy opening up this southern part of the Mississippi, and Union land forces opening up this part of the Mississippi. Over here, no joy whatsoever for the Union forces. Out in the West, victory after victory. So by the end of 1862, you have the battles of Iuka, battles of Corinth, battle of Murfreesboro, to add to this list of Union victories. The Union has won this chunk, and they've won this very important base right here, the only thing in the West that remains, Vicksburg. So 1863, what happens here? Starting with the Eastern Theater. We're going to start Eastern Theater this time. Two major battles that we need to know about. The first one is the Battle of Chancellorsville. After Fredericksburg, Hooker tried to maneuver around Lee's flank, but Lee outwitted him and moved his troops to Chancellorsville, which was a plantation. And the Union lines are pretty strong against him. But what Lee knows is something that the Union Army doesn't know. So here's Lee's forces. Lee's men are actually from this region. In fact, I think it was Jackson actually had a preacher that knew a family here, and they tell Lee about this little pathway through dense woods outside of Federal observation points. The Federals can't see him. So here's Lee's line. So what does Lee do? He sends Stonewall Jackson on a forced march. Then Jackson basically lines up real quietly and then just attacks into the exposed right flank of the Union Army. And the whole Union Army just rolls up like a rug, and they are routed again. Now, during the course of the fighting, though, Jackson himself was killed, and Jackson was considered a pretty brilliant battlefield commander and not a bad strategist either. So this is a serious loss to Lee. But what Lee wants to do at this point is he wants to once again try to make the attack in the north. He's feeling good after these victories. And so, I'm sorry, those are the Union forces. So what does he do? He sets off on a march. He's marching through, and he's got his forces broken up, divided, so that way they can march faster. And this is the important thing here. This is his cavalry, Jeb Stuart, young officer that liked to view himself as a bit of a cavalier. And Jeb Stuart, he used to do these famous things called ride-arounds, where he would go and ride around the Union Army, gain notice in the papers and all that. And so he's out here doing another ride-around, but Lee has no clue what the Union forces are doing without Jeb Stuart, because this is essentially how you gained intel as a commander back then. So what happens? Well, the Union and the Confederate forces, just kind of bump into each other at Gettysburg. And Gordon Meade recognizes that he has this great battlefield advantage in terms of terrain, because what the land around him does is it fish hooks. Creates a fish hook. And so he has, these two hills up here where his men are entrenched. He has two more hills down here where they're entrenched. He's got this large bulk of army right there. And Lee's forces are the ones that are spread out. And so, Meade can sit there and reinforce from any point of the line so easily. But Lee decides to attack. And in the end, the final attack is the famous Pickett's Charge, in which he loses at least a good, he sends 13,000 men under the command of General Pickett against the center of Lee's line, thinking that Lee's thin here because he's reinforced so much here, and over here. And actually, this is a large army under General Hancock. And of the 13,000 troops under Pickett, only like a handful of them end up surviving. And so after the charge, Lee meets Pickett on the field, and he's asking, Pickett, hey, where's your men? And Pickett looks at him and says, General Lee, I have no division now. He was gone. That was it. This is for Lee. This is a serious moment. He's the one retreating this time. I mean, he really got beat, and he lost 24,000 men to he had lost 24,000 casualties there. He can't replace those. Back in the Union, though, they still have immigrants coming in from overseas. Emancipation Proclamation also included, with Lincoln, some of the very first decisions to start arming African Americans, because he views this entire slave population as potential recruits down here, people that have a desperate desire for freedom and are willing to fight for it, plus all of the free blacks living up here. He has a potential pool of recruitment. Lee doesn't. It's going to cost Lee. Now, right at the same, this is fought between July 1st through 4th on July. So he loses July 4th at Gettysburg. And then at the same time, Grant pulls a miracle out of his hat. He's been trying to attack Vicksburg, but there's this Yazoo River system up here that prevents it. There's the Mississippi. At one point, he even tried to dig a canal to divert the Mississippi to let his men march south. Didn't work. So finally, he just says, forget it. Leaves all of his baggage behind, takes his men on this risky march around the Confederate lines, deep into enemy territory. Hits Jackson, Mississippi, marches over and lays a siege on Vicksburg. Lasts a long time, but the siege finally collapses on July 4th when the general there finally surrenders his men. And by that time, the people in the city were so desperate they were living off of rats. So, serious victory needed up here, and out here, the Union now has control of the Mississippi. They now have control of the Tennessee. They control the oceans. The noose is being tightened around the South. Their east-west trade route gone, and this is where a lot of the guns used to come up. Is Texas used to smuggle them through Mexico because the United States couldn't effectively blockade that country. So it's looking bad for them. And it's at this point that Grant starts dreaming of marching on Atlanta. He wants to go deep into the South. He wants to hit their heart. He wants to not only divide them in half, he wants to sever them into 3 pieces at this point. So he will dispatch, first of all, he will get a call from his superiors. And he is now not only the commander of the Western forces, he's been given command over all the Union forces because, as Lincoln once said, this man fights. So what does he do? He moves back over here. He's taken his command, and he's setting up against Lee, the major target in the east. So what happens is Gordon Meade, the guy that led the victory at Gettysburg, he actually remains the battlefield commander. He takes care of all the day-to-day stuff. What Grant's going to do from here is coordinate everything. And from here, he's already started to send men, deep into the heart of the South. The problem is that the very first leader that he chooses, a guy by the name of Rosecrans, he fails at the Battle of Chattanooga. He's defeated trying to attack Southern forces. What this basically does is it gets Grant to pull Rosecrans from command after he loses to Braxton Bragg, replaces him with William Tecumseh Sherman, a guy that was given to bouts of depression but very, very capable. And this is a guy that actually knows the stakes in this war. He understands what has to be done. That the South, he and Grant are one on the concept that the South is their agricultural resources are the key to breaking them. So what he basically tells Sherman is he says, well, you go through there, he's like, destroy everything that can be used to help the war effort. Anything that can be used, crops, whatever you can't carry, burn them. Livestock, eat them or kill them. Railroads, tear them up. And so this march to Atlanta, Sherman by the Southerners is viewed as, a very cruel individual, a monster. In fact, after he takes Atlanta, he's approached by the mayor, and Sherman just looks at him and says, war is cruelty and you can't refine it. Now that war comes home to you, you feel very different. You deprecate its horrors, but did not feel them when you sent carloads of soldiers and ammunition to carry war into Kentucky and mid-Tennessee. He later went on to tell someone else that we cannot change the hearts of those people of the South, but we can make war so terrible and make them so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it. So Chickamauga, Rosecrans is out, and another general, General Thomas, is in with General Sherman. And General Thomas leads his troops at the Battle of Chickamauga and really kind of opens the path for Sherman towards Atlanta. Now, 1863 also had long-ranging impacts. First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect January 1st. It is now law. And in the North, there's still a lot of people that are unhappy about fighting to free African American slaves, but they're starting to come around and realize that, the one can't end without the other. But that doesn't keep unrest from occurring. I mean, this is a time where you're actually having some revolts in cities. You have people that view the war as senseless, that desire compromise. And there's enough unrest that in the election of 1864, Lincoln realizes this. He needs the war over because it's only going to be so much longer that he can keep people together. And in the election of 1864, it wasn't a gimme for Lincoln. Lincoln had to hold together a coalition. You had Republicans that were moderate. They weren't keen on the idea of abolishing slavery, and they wanted to compromise. And then you had the radical Republicans that wanted abolition. They wanted the Southerners to pay. You had Northern Democrats, and more than that, Northern Democrats that sympathized with the South. So one of these were the Copperheads. So when it was Lincoln heading the Republicans against his former General George B. McClellan, Lincoln had a run on his hand, and he ended up winning. Though he did end up winning. So going into 1864, he decided that he was going to pass the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, which he would manage to do. And he would also start thinking about Reconstruction, and this is when he would issue the 10% plan, which we'll look at when we get to Reconstruction. Now, interestingly enough, is once again showing how far Lincoln's willing to go to end this war. You had a governor of Ohio by the name of Clement V. L. Vallandigham. He was one of these Democrats just absolutely against conflict. He's a copperhead. Is constantly criticizing Lincoln, And when he finally made criticisms that Lincoln viewed as tantamount to, sympathizing and supporting the Southern cause, Clement Vallandigham was tried and found guilty. But instead of sending him to jail, Lincoln, in his normal wry sense of humor, decided that since Vallandigham loved the South so much, he could go there, and so he exiles Vallandigham to the South, which is. Lincoln, you gotta love the guy. So 1864 rolling around. 1864 is dominated by William Tecumseh Sherman. He continues his march to Atlanta, and Atlanta falls finally on September 1st of 1864. Over here in the north, Lee is not fighting any of these other generals that were a little more cautious, a little more timid. He's fighting Grant. So what happens? Grant starts the year right off, the Wilderness Campaign. engages Lee from May 5th through the 7th, and then again the major conflict on the 12th in this area. And this is the fighting down here. It's really brutal because it's just very close quarter. It's so densely wooded. And then the final battle at the right after the Wilderness is Spotsylvania Courthouse. And here at what's known as the Mule Shoe, the Bloody Angle, there are so many casualties that they said that the bodies stacked up like three bodies deep, where the Confederates had entrenched on this key point called the Mule Shoe. But what Grant does after this is he doesn't say, "Oh well, Lee held the field and I have too many casualties. I'm going to retreat." No, he's ordered his people press on. So what he's going to do is after this maneuver, he maneuvers again. And what Lee has to do is Lee has to maneuver. And what's Grant saying is, okay, I may not be the clear victor, but what I am is I'm now the owner of all of this territory. And this is the race to Richmond, and some of the battles in this conflict are nasty. So at this battle of Cold Harbor on June 2nd and 3rd, basically Union and Confederate forces, it's really foggy, it's really dark. The Union troops don't really know where the Confederate lines are, and just nasty casualties. In fact, one Union soldier wrote in his diary prior to going in that his last entry was June 3rd, Cold Harbor, I was killed. So 17,000 some odd casualties, over 12,000 of those Union. And in the North, Grant's becoming known as the Butcher, but again, he got territory. If you go back to Ambrose and those guys, this is where they started, and that's where they were. They hadn't moved an inch. So finally what Lee does is what Grant does is he maneuvers Lee to where Lee has to defend Petersburg here, because there's a rail line that connects Petersburg and Richmond. Sorry, I went the wrong way there. Petersburg and Richmond, right in that area. So Petersburg falls, its supplies fall, Richmond falls. And he settles in for a long siege, and the siege goes from 15th of June to 1864. And, Grant wants to get the war over with. He wants to get it over with so bad. So what he decides to, he even takes some serious gambles. So there's this one battle known as the Battle of the Crater. Here's all the entrenchments of the, let me get back there. These are the entrenchments of the Confederate line. And over here you have the Union troops. What Grant decides to do is he decides to listen to a group of miners, some soldiers that worked in the mines, and they dig this hole, this tunnel, all the way under Union lines, and they plant these explosives. And they decide they're just going to blow up the line. And so Grant has all of his men back here, and they've trained. And Grant understands that once there's the big hole in the earth, that you're going to have to fight your way up and out of it. And so he's telling them, you got to use ladders, you got to be ready for this and that. So they're ready for it. They've been briefed. So the day comes, they blow a big hole right there in the middle of the Confederate lines. And at the last moment, changes had been made. Because initially the troops that were going to lead it was an African-American unit, and then Grant decides, well, if all these guys die, then, that may look bad, you're radical Republicans, and so he swaps people out at the last moment to lead the charge. You'll still have African-American troops in there. They're still going to meet the same fate, but it's just a last-minute decision that cost him. Because what happens is these troops, they start off, and, here's the hole. And they're running, they run right down the hole, and then they get there and they say, oops, forgot the ladder. And then northern troops southern troops just start shooting down on them. Bloodbath. But 2nd April 1865, Petersburg falls. And once Petersburg falls, Lee knows he can't stay there. And so he begins his retreat. And he is just trying to stay out of the way of Grant and his men, trying to link up with some other Southern units. But then it happens. He comes to a place, Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th. Actually, the irony is he ends up surrendering in the same guy's house that got blown up. So the owner of this house ended up having his old house blown up at the first Battle of Bull Run. But Appomattox Courthouse, 9 April, after the fall of Petersburg, he surrenders. And that's it. Now, that's not to say that all the fighting was over with. May 12th to 13th, there was fighting outside of Brownsville, Texas, but keep in mind, a lot of communication lines have been cut, so it took a little while to get the message to these folks that the war was over with. But a lot of people under Lee wanted to continue the fight. They wanted to break up and start a guerrilla campaign, but Lee just said, it's over, and he was not about to put people through that again. And so from this point on, it's just a matter of rounding up the leadership of the Confederacy and going through Reconstruction. But we'll never know what happened with Reconstruction. Lincoln always said that he hoped that the better angels of our nature would guide us, not only in the war but after the war. And he wanted to reconstruct with malice towards none. I'm using his words here. So how would he have done it? Could he have commanded the nation in a way that perhaps was more positive, more guided? Well, we'll never know. It was on April 14th in Ford's Theater, a Southern sympathizer by the name of John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln in Ford's Theater. So we look at the American Civil War, and it's really kind of more than just a war. This is a war that's going to end the slave society that's been in the South, and it reorganizes politics. It goes in with two separate countries, really, a North and a South, an industrialized North and a Southern society that owns slaves and looks back to. They still have a culture that revolves around aristocracy, likening themselves to the lords and the ladies of the medieval times. That society is defeated in the American Civil War. And so what is going to emerge is going to be a unified country. And it's not just America that's unifying. This is the time when the different states that in Southern Europe come together to form Italy, when central states come together to form Germany. It's nation making throughout Europe and the United States. But this nation's going to be different. The United States will be different emerging out of it. But first they'll have to get through Reconstruction. And that's what we'll look at in the next video. Thank you.